Welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, where we celebrate the craft of poetry. Each week we feature interviews with incredible poets, songwriters, and artists, including Olivia Gatwood, Safia El Hilo, Dana Gioia, and many more. We also feature periodic submitted poetry episodes. Visit viewlesswings.com to submit your original poetry. I'm your host, James Moorhead, Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, and author of Canvas, Portraits of Red and Gray, and The Plague Doctor. Hit subscribe and follow me on Instagram or Threads at Viewless Wings. Lauren Ducrey is an award-winning poet, speaker, mindfulness facilitator, AI designer, ex-Google, and string cheese enthusiast. When she's not designing more emotionally supportive AI, she's on a mission to break poetry out of its ivory tower as an accessible tool to support our well-being. She spent 7 years at Google hacking poetry into the workplace with team building and leadership training that build on the connective power of language. She also supports individuals writing themselves out loud through workshops, writing courses, and one-on-one mentoring. She weaves a poetic community wherever she goes, hosting events and interactive performances in New York City and Paris. Her tools of choice on this mission are her 2 Masters in Literature and Social Innovation, her previous lives as a political speechwriter and educator, as well as an unrelenting sense of humor. Her book of poems, Tongues Tied, and her album of poetry and music, Cordes Sensibles, make words leap off the page in conversation with artwork and original riffs. Her pieces are also featured in Idiom magazine, Humankind magazine, FaberNovel.com, as well as in mindfulness apps Minderful and Rogalife. Her piece, The Second Cactus, is the laureate of the 2022 Moving Words competition, an international project bringing poems to the screen with animators and filmmakers. Lauren, welcome to the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Very excited to talk to you. But before we get to the thing that got me excited to talk to you, let's start with some basics. When do you first remember discovering poetry? And discovering it not because it was assigned to you, but where you actually had a connection with poetry?
Great question. I have a vivid memory as a child, probably 6 or 7. Around Christmas time, I would want to come up with crafty ideas for very affordable Christmas gifts. And I remember making tea and then soaking paper in the tea and then drying it to make it look like parchment. And I would write poems to my parents as Christmas gifts. So that's a vivid one for sure.
Oh, I'm sure they absolutely treasured and loved those and hopefully saved those away in their memorabilia box.
They have. That's part of why the memory is so vivid, is that they pulled it out a few years ago when I got back into poetry more seriously. And I was reminded of that very cute, crafty poetry moment.
Oh, wonderful. And I think that's one interesting thing about poetry is it can be very bite-sized. It would be harder to do like a novel as your gift every year. It's not very practical. Like poetry has this amazing ability to fit into so many different contexts because it can be very short. It doesn't have to be, but it can be.
Absolutely. I think that's why we can get into this maybe a little bit more in depth, but I think that's why it's making such a resurgence in the era of social media where bite-sized content is the norm. I love that this form that is very deep fits into short format writing so appropriately.
Yeah, and that kind of leads to my second question, which is what makes poetry such a unique art form for you? I have my own answer, but what is your personal answer about what makes it so unique? And you've sort of touched on one piece of it.
I feel like there's so many ways I could answer that question, but what keeps on coming up for me is how poetry to me sits uniquely at the intersection of our analytical mind and our more emotional mind, because it uniquely uses language to go beyond language, which to me is nothing short of magic, right? It uses language, which is this very analytical, logical thing that helps us to organize a pretty chaotic world into concepts. But then it uses those words that point to concepts to evoke and elicit our emotions, our imagination, our intuition. And so it really bridges both of those things I think more so than any other art form.
Mm-hmm.
Again, because I think painting, it uses color. Color to me immediately goes into that more emotional, sensorial realm. Dance is extremely embodied, but poetry uses this thing that can make us so analytical language, but it uses it to do something very non-analytical, very emotional, and that fascinates me.
And then you can also perform poetry, and poems can take on two lives. How
Exactly.
the poem is read on the page and visually displaces blank space, and how the poem is heard and connects with you that way. It's just, yeah, it's an amazing art form. So you have a very unique background where you have an AI element to your background too. And I have played with, I'm sure many of us has played with AI tools to create poetry, and oh my goodness, I do not feel threatened by AI tools for the creation of poetry. It's functional, but it is dreadful. It's soulless. However, I have found for research can be quite handy to do research in a more contextual way. I use it as a critique tool. I'd say on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 is a poetry coach I work with, an AI tool can be a 2 or 3 as a 24/7 sniff test, where it may see, I put that in air quotes, see things that I hadn't seen. But they can be challenging because the AI is aimed to please, so they can be a little bit too happy. So what is with your AI side of your background and poetry intersection? What are your thoughts about AI and poetry?
Yeah. Many. So for context, I spent 7 years designing the personalities of virtual agents like the Google Assistant or Google's Gemini. So really thinking about the dialogue and interaction and what role a virtual agent has in with a human in a human relationship. And the first thing that came to mind as I was doing that work in relationship to my poetry was just the minutia of language. And I think this steps away from like writing poetry, but it's just really bearing witness to the impact of the words that we choose, because when we're designing for AI, it's usually pretty limited interactions, especially with vocal agents, where when you're having a conversation, you can't just spit out these massive chunks of text because nobody can parse that much information. So bring the minutia of language into mind whenever writing anything, truly. I think that started to bleed into many different types of writing and many different types of communication. So I think that's one relationship. But then getting into writing poetry with AI, you kind of touched upon this in what you were sharing with the aim to please. I think what's cool with AI is that you can frame it to be the help that you need, right? So you could even prompt it to be a certain type of writing coach for yourself, which I think in turn grows our self-awareness, right? As you use it, you're like, wait, what is helpful to me? And I think AI is playing that role more and more of being a mirror for us humans,
Mm-hmm.
in the way that, when we're like, okay, is AI replacing what makes us human? Is it creating the art that we want to create? Is it replacing human interactions? It's like, well, what in this remains human, what is properly human? And I think that mirroring is a really interesting value of AI, really questioning what makes us human. And I was just working on a course on creative AI, and in all the creative AI explorations that go back to like the 30s, there was like a screenwriting AI that was created. In the 60s and 70s, there were music AIs that were already created. After that, there was a Kurzweiler's cybernetic poet
Mm-hmm.
that generated poetry. And what all of these people say, that what was most interesting in the process wasn't necessarily the output, to your point, right? That you said it's kind of soulless, but it was what creating the AI tool taught them about the practice. So like what we learn about music by creating an AI tool that can help us make music. What do we learn about our own writing practice as we use AI as a tool, not as just a spit out poetry, but as a tool for us to write poetry? And I've noticed I use it a lot as a kind of like thesaurus on steroids,
Yeah,
where it's not just
contextual thesaurus. Yes. Yes.
exactly, which I'm trying to get to this idea. So I'll describe like what's a word to describe this, but with that and this nuance, da 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 da. Give me a list of 10 words. And then from those 10 words, I find inspiration. And it's a back and forth, which I think is a really important thing to stress with AI, is that it's going to be quite boring and monolithic if you just expect to ask it one thing and get an answer. It's truly a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this ties to my next question. Is you managed to bring poetry into corporate workshops, including during your time at Google, and I enjoyed one of your courses, and have now taken the leap to start your own business. How have your workshops evolved over the years? What have you learned through that journey of creating something that's pretty unique? I don't think there's 10,000 Laurens that are running around doing this type of programming. This is pretty unique and innovative.
Thank you. I haven't found other versions of me, but what I did find, which was somewhat unexpected, was the amount of people within tech, and Google for one, that are passionate about poetry and using language creatively. And that was a big learning. That was an instinct. I was like, if there's one of me and my team, the team I was on at Google is very creative, a lot of journalists and game designers, novelists, and poets, actually. I was like, okay, there must be more. And I got confirmation of that within the very analytical, logical-minded world of tech, people are thirsty for spaces where they can practice their creativity, but also connect with other folks on this more emotional, vulnerable level. And that's been the massive takeaway from these workshops, that were based on this premise that we spend so much of our working day working that left brain, analytical, logical muscle. And being, I would say, our performance is often judged by that metric. But what baffles me at the same time, we're kind of implicitly being asked to be very emotionally intelligent without many tools. I mean, at Google, there's literally this kind of ask to thrive in ambiguity, right? And ambiguity is not about being logical and analytical. It's being really comfortable with the discomfort of not knowing precisely the next step in your project. That to me is poetry, because I think poems ask more questions than they offer answers.
Yeah.
When you read a poem, you get comfortable in that not knowing, in the ambiguity. So I'm like, for me, I was like, okay, we need to learn how to get comfortable with ambiguity. Boom, poems. And again, poems, because they're steeped in language, they're not completely removed from our day-to-day interactions that are all in language. We're writing emails, we're writing pitch decks, like everything is steeped in language. So it's related enough to our day-to-day work, but it's bringing us into that space of emotional awareness and of practicing ambiguity that we can then pour back into our work. So that's the cycle that I saw being performed in these workshops.
And what have you learned from the participants in your workshops that helped you evolve how you approach this?
I learned that people want to be seen for more than just their job title.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big one that comes out of this, where it's, wow, I was reminded that I'm a human, even if only for an hour in my workday, and that I'm a data analyst, but I'm actually also creative, which, in my heart of hearts, I know, but it's different for people to have other people recognize that in them through conversation. I think that witnessing is a key component. And from that stems a lot of energy, where I think, you can think, why am I going to take an hour out of my workday to do something seemingly totally unrelated to this deadline that I have? Well, because people exit these workshops and they're like, I am so energized and so inspired. I'm actually excited to go back to my totally unrelated job and nail it, maybe with a new point of view as well, and a refreshed perspective.
Absolutely. Well, that leads into walk me through one of the lessons you bring to participants during your workshops that listeners of this podcast can take away with them, and then maybe get them curious about learning more about what you do.
Yeah. So one of the workshops that I've been doing for the longest time is around building, I would say, team building and leadership skills. And we don't even write poetry in this workshop. So there's no anxiety around putting pen to paper, although that's an option in other workshops. And the idea here is that I share a little bit about the psychology of poetry. And there's some really interesting research about the way that our brain actually reacts to poetry as instinctively as it does to music. So anyone can hear poetry, even if your rational, analytical, intellectual mind doesn't, quote unquote, understand it. And once we've established the basis of how poetry can move your mind, can act as a mindfulness practice, right? Because poems, in a way, they're just these almost these microscopes onto reality. They allow you to just notice what is happening around you in your environment, in your thoughts, and your emotions. So once you've experienced or learned about the psychology, learned about how poetry can be a mindfulness practice, you get to experience that by listening to a poem without reading it. And again, we're very visually orientated, usually as humans, and especially as work. We're constantly looking at screens, and you get an opportunity to sit back and listen and practice receiving words like you would listen to music, which I think is a great practice in conversation, right? Where in conversation, we're so used to listening to someone and they're halfway through saying what they're saying, and you are already anticipating your response. Mm-hmm. Therefore, you're not actually listening to them.
Yeah.
And at work, this can lead to such a loss of key information, right? Like literally not hearing a spec on a project that you're working on, or if you're a manager, missing out on the emotional tenor of what your report is trying to share with you that might be difficult or vulnerable. And I think in leadership, that's a really important skill to have. So we'll practice that listening. And then we go into conversation where you actually get to read the poems and unpack them with the people in your group. And this is where I like to say that poems become a table around which we can disagree productively, which I think is also a rare opportunity at work. Most people, at least I know for myself, I want to agree with my coworkers. It's like hard to be in that productive disagreement space because it can feel like, wow, you're contradicting your manager. That's really scary. Or even in life, having our public sphere is getting more and more polarized. And I think we are losing skills to have constructive disagreement. So this last part of the workshop really focuses on, you can disagree on a poem. It's just a poem, but people get into spaces of sharing about their personal experiences of life, how they differ from others, but also how similar, oftentimes, that's what comes out of these workshops. It's like, wow, we're actually all kind of going through the same work stress or the same family stress or the same friend stress. Can we recognize our commonalities and then have constructive conversations based on just our human connection?
So I think in my role as Poet Laureate of Dublin, California, which has been a blast for the last few years, I've been reminded how popular poetry is, but hidden within communities. So I do an open mic at a local pizza place, done that for 3 years now. And most of the time, half of the people coming to the open mic have never shared their poetry in public ever before. And all age ranges, all backgrounds. And it really just locked into my mind that there are many, many more people writing poetry than you get a feel for at a bookstore. And I want to kind of get your experience as how has poetry evolved and changed, especially with social networks and the ability to, as you pointed out earlier, share bite-sized pieces of information.
I've had the exact same experience. I also run open mics here in New York City and in Paris, where I'm originally from, and exactly the same. It is heartbreaking in the best way possible to see people come up to the mic and share their first poem ever as an adult. They've obviously been writing for a couple of years secretly. And I think that's true of many art forms, but there's something particularly intimate about poetry that you keep it in the private sphere. But some of these poems are amazing. And I'm like, what? How has this stayed, hidden for all these years? So yes, lots of hidden poetic talent that is out there. Absolutely. And I think social media in that sense is allowing for a space that might feel less vulnerable than the out loud version. I think voice is a very tender, because it's so embodied, because it's so immediate, can feel very scary. I had debilitating stage fright for the longest time, and now I perform on stages everywhere. And poetry was a big part in healing that fear. But yeah, social media, there's a buffer, between you and the world, right? Like you're posting from the comfort of your home or, behind a screen, which, leads to people having very unaccountable behaviors, I would say, but in a way it can be very freeing. And I know that I used social media at the beginning of my journey as an accountability tool where I told myself, okay, Lauren, you're going to share one poem a week. And whether you think you've perfectly edited it or not, that's not the point. You're actually going to practice imperfection and vulnerability. So I think that in that sense, it can be great. And it can be great to find community, like you mentioned, that's hidden more easily. I've connected with people, from all over the world that I would never otherwise have connected with through social media.
And you touched on performing poetry, and that's poetry, and just sharing the text of it is a vulnerable experience, and doing it in front of a mic it adds on all the layers of public speaking and things that most people are terrified of. So how did you go from getting over I don't know if you get over the fear. My parents are musicians, and they say the day you're not nervous before a performance is the day you should retire. But yes, using that nerves as fuel, not as a barrier. Like, what was your journey to getting to a place of comfort at the mic, even if the nerves are still there?
Yeah, there's this awesome quote, and I can't remember by who, that says that it's like nervousness is excitement without the breath. Something along those lines. I'm slightly misquoting. But it's true. It's like as soon as you start breathing, it just becomes excitement versus being this constricted feeling of fear. When somebody told me that was a big unlock to face the stage fright. I mean, like, oh, right. You want that energy because you want to step up on the stage and convey something with power and with strength and with emotion. You don't want to, like you were saying, the day you no longer feel that, your performance is probably not going to.
It'll be flat. It just, you'll take it for granted, or all these things that are not healthy. Yeah, for a good performance. Yeah.
But you don't want the fear to rule you either. And the key to me was the breath. So my journey was working with vocal coaches and realizing, okay, I need some professional help, both of which were professional singers. The breath was obviously a super big component because professional singers spend so much time relearning how to breathe the diaphragmatic breath. So just breathing from your belly, and that just soothes your nervous system immediately. And then something else that I did was just practice, kind of like exposure therapy, actually sign up to open mics, or, if I'm being truthful, hosting open mics helped me more so because I had a dedicated time and space where I didn't just host them. I always start my open mics with an introduction to why I think poetry is approachable, how folks can receive it as music versus this very brainy thing. But having that dedicated space for performance every month, which I was doing in New York, really helped me get comfortable to the point where now I try to always remind myself when I step up on stage, it's not about me. I'm a steward of the words. I think this is a really helpful mindset as well, where it's like, I am here in service to the words to deliver them the best way possible. And as soon as I think of that, it's more about like, oh yeah, like what rhythm do I want to give to this piece? Where do I want to lay emphasis on this or that word? And that just takes you out of your like, I, me, my story of what are people going to think of me? Are they going to think I sound good? I look good, like blah, 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 blah. That very ego-centered approach that the stage fright feeds off of.
No, you really want them walking away remembering the poem and the impact of the poem on them, and perhaps they remember you too, but that is definitely secondary. I think that's a really useful insight. Well, that's a perfect lead-in to passing the mic over to you to share several of your poems.
So this piece is titled When We Go because I wrote it as an introduction to my friend's song that we kind of co-wrote. And the title of the song is When We Go because that's a line within the song. And one day, the community of madness that are the voices inside your head will become so loud. They will shake you with all their hands and push tears through your eyes until you very nearly forget that you can hold yourself. until you very nearly forget that this net of thought is desperate to catch your ocean of unstoppable emotion. That this net of thought feels so true because you've precisely made it to keep reality from view. And it will rope you into a place where you can't remember that your body has got your back. Your body has got your back. So sit up, sit straight, take a breath and feel yourself. Feel yourself with the same strong, soft touch as your mother, friend, or lover. And invite them under your skin until you warm with the present memory of their faces and familiar embraces. And you realize that your body is a home, because anyone who's ever moved you still lives inside. And then one day, the community of madness that are the voices inside your head will become a loud invitation to summon the community of kindness that are the voices of your people instead. And then this piece I would like to share is from my first book of poetry that's called Tongues Tied. And I wrote this piece after a session with a vocal coach. And the session was more therapy than singing or vocalizing, really. We worked through a lot of emotions, to put it simply. And after the session, I was alone in my apartment and I start singing to myself. And I hear this falsetto, which I'd never, ever heard before in my life, come out of my own body. And it was like I was observing the actual sound of my voice when my body was fully opened and relaxed. And mind-blowing experience to have. And from that came this poem that I titled An Instrument of Breath and Bones. At the age of 29, she learned that breathing is hard. Remembered that as a child, she had known. She hadn't known, she simply had breathed. Unapologetically ravenous for air, her body used to defy gravity. A drum, thirsty for resonance, ribs expanding, uncaged, rippling beneath skin, teeth sucking in breath and the expectant swirl of a shout, an excited scream, or to usher in the loud silence that punctuates a gasp of awe. She had forgotten the depth of her body, shortened her range, lived off of small sips taken with shy lips. At the age of 29, she learned that she should breathe like she drinks water, gallons at a time. So she sang. A tune floated up from stomach, lungs, throat. She'd sang it before. No, it had sung her before. Lifted up through the air, a thread strung her mouth, a needle threaded. Note sewed skirts out of thin air and unhemmed her insides that fluttered with the tickle of vocal cords. There was something eternal about the air. She recognized the unnameable quality of folk song, a melody that comes from nowhere and speaks to everything. She mused with the idea of this being the voice of the earth, or whatever capitalized word people use to speak of that, which we all know is out there, is in here. That, which all writing just fails to outline with letters and punctuation. That to which all music tries to dance to. which all art brushes upon, sculpts into, builds for, composes with pencils through, hums for, blueprints and choreographs around. A ribbon lifted, unraveled her spine, creased, soft, untethered. The sound that had made her before rose again. She struggled gently against the tensing, against the calcified fear whose layers seemed to peel endlessly. Befriend it, they say. She said, okay, remember what they say. They. All of those who touched her where the mineral deposits ossify, that got their fingers ashen with her internal debris, that fumbled kind hands on petrified insides and helped her feel that what feels like rock is sometimes only chalk. She said, okay, turned her attention from where it tightened to everywhere around, to nowhere really, and opened her mouth. Let sound dissolve the scab of skin that once needed healing, that once needed less feeling. The small tremors may crumble for a moment, and for a moment she bathes in an emanation of acoustics and air. The memory of a tune has its own agency. She was afraid she wouldn't remember. Her mind twitched, realizing she didn't know how to write music, but the memory of a tune has its own agency. In that moment it returned, had never left, was always there to be strung. Where do notes come from? Where do they live when they're not sung? She realized the air around her was always pregnant with her voice. And all the music, there for the plucking. The body, an instrument of breath and bones. And then the last piece that I would like to share, hesitating. Now, the last piece I would like to share is also from my book, and it's the first poem in this book. It's titled Itchy Heels, and the prompt was from one of the very first poetry writing workshops that I did, and the prompt was to write a poem in one single sentence. So there can be, commas, semicolons, etc., but the structure has to respect grammar and hold for one sentence. Itchy heels. After walking out the glass doors with a fresh breeze that makes my heels click, I turn right into the fast waning sun towards which I deliberately march, beating the snare drum of his last hours, with hooved feet itching to scamper straight down my favorite diagonal. I dart from my big 14th Street building block and head body first downtown, and setting rays graze the rolling pastures of my grin before dipping into dimples of delight that tug at the corners of my mouth, full with an appetite whetted by humid streets into which these tootsies on a roll take juicy bites, or rather, nibble at, with a precise clinical hunger to get lost. Demoted from being me, promoted to being anybody, striding for the pleasure of adventure and anonymity. But I don't get lost. I always end up finding what I was looking for in yet another Chinatown shop, into which I wander without fail and wonder, and cruise down shelved avenues. My heels click their lips, smacking of dirty souls, soy sauce, and solitary strolls. And that journey that I'm describing is actually from exiting the New York Google office on 14th Street and walking downtown all the way to Chinatown, which I did almost as a ritual every other week or so.
I love listening to poets on this podcast that I've created recite their work. And in your case, you make a beautiful use of silence. And I think that's one of the takeaways that I hope people listening is don't be afraid of silence. When just like one poet described it as writing poetry is displacing the blank space just enough and not one ounce more. And your recitation, you'd have no idea that you had performance anxiety earlier on, which I certainly did too. I was brutally shy in middle school and into high school, and then it was really college that cured me of that, or made me see it, like you said, a different way. So I just loved hearing you recite that. And also your comment that it was this walking down the street. Poems are beautiful because they can bring to life such small moments in a powerful way. They don't need to be Lord of the Rings epics, and they shouldn't be.
I always remind myself of that and try to impress that upon people who join my workshops, that I think poetry bears witness to all the things that otherwise we ignore, right? It observes the invisible. And so you can sit down at your desk, take whatever object is around you, try and write a poem about it, because you'll probably notice something that you'd never noticed about, a glass just being this functional thing that you drink with. Like, there's a world in that glass that's sitting on your desk. So absolutely.
And just to close, where can people learn more about you and your workshops and get in touch with you and experience one of the incredible experiences that you bring into businesses and other groups? Yeah.
So if your curiosity is piqued about how this works for businesses, please head to my website. There's a corporate page that will tell you more, and then we can book a call. And I am always curious to learn about people's specific teams and challenges and how poetry can address those more specifically. So my website, which is www.laurenducrey.com. And then I also host monthly workshops, one that's more focused on poetry for well-being, and one that's called Get Your Scribble On, which is a very playful space to just make that precious time for writing, learn some craft, but we're not here to, write perfect sonnets. This is really about getting playful and reminding ourselves of the playfulness of poetry. And those are on Eventbrite. So you can look up Lauren Ducrey on Eventbrite. They're also listed on my website, but those are monthly. And I change up the theme every month. So you get a new perspective on kind of like big life theme, like, presence or transitions or belonging or friendship, etc.
Awesome. Well, I encourage everybody to check out Lauren Ducrey, and I will put links in the show notes, of course. And Lauren, thank you so much for sharing your poetry and your voice on the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast.
Thank you so much. Just adding a tiny last little plug. I'm active on Instagram and LinkedIn. Those are the two social platforms. Facebook, not so much, because they kicked me off because I got hacked. So Instagram and LinkedIn. But thank you so much for this delightful conversation. It definitely is leaving me inspired.
Terrific. Thank you. The Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast is written and produced by James Moorhead. You can follow me on Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at Viewless Wings. Hit subscribe to be notified of every episode of the Viewless Wings Poetry Podcast, and spread the word with your poetry community.